Start now. Okay, so yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's Alan Miles here. I'm the sales director for our NetSuite division, for those of you who don't know me already. And today's session is just to give you a bit of a preview into the new features that are coming in NetSuite's next release, which is the 2021.1 release, which is due to be released in the next few weeks. So we like to do these sessions just before the release comes out, just to give you a bit of a preview of what's coming. We won't be able to show you the functionalities. We don't have access to the demo systems just yet, but it just gives you a feel for some of the main highlights of what's coming, and also the process for the upgrade itself. So I'll give you a bit of a background and just a reminder of what happens with the release and the preview that you get to it, and then we'll run through our top 10 highlights of the features that we think are going to make a big difference as part of this release. So in terms of the release process, just to give you a heads up, currently all our customers are scheduled to be upgraded between February and May. The NetSuite upgrade is done in 4 phases. Most customers, from what we can see, are part of phase 3, which is mid-April, but you'll be alerted to your actual upgrade date through your new release portal in the system, as well as the emails that go to the system administrators. The new release portlet can be added to your dashboard. That's where you would see your upgrade date, and also any links to the key features, the release notes, and test plans and training resources as well. So if that's not on your dashboard already, you can add it on by going to personalize and then choose the new release option from within the menu that appears. To get access to the preview, which is your own system, from a certain date, there'll be a snapshot taken, and then that will be upgraded to the latest version. You have to request access to that, which administrators can do from the setup menu, and that's in Setup, Company, Release Preview. And you can use that system then to review the new functionality, but also test all of any key processes and customizations that you have in the system already, because that will be your system with your data in the release preview. One thing to note about what we're going to go through today, the new features are subject to change. Sometimes something that is planned doesn't quite make it into the actual version once it's released, and also some new things might appear in last minute that weren't planned if they're completed in time. So the release notes that there's a link to in your dashboard are reviewed weekly, and they'll be updated to add or remove anything that's changed in terms of what's due to be released. The new release portal, just to show you that's what it looks like, has some links to some of the key highlights from the new release in different areas. There are some sneak peek videos, your login to the release preview, the release notes, which is a detailed guide to every single change that's been made, and then some guides on how to actually access the release preview, and some testing guides as well. So now, as I say, we've picked out our top 10 feature highlights. They are kind of in order, but most of them are similar importance. The most features that we've seen in this release tend to be kind of relatively small enhancements to existing functionality, but along with some pretty good new additional features as well. So the first one we've picked out is actually an enhancement to one that we highlighted as the number 1 change in the last release in 2020.2, which was the invoice grouping feature. That was version 1 of the invoice grouping feature, and what that allowed you to do was essentially achieve consolidated invoicing for your customers by being able to group multiple sales invoices together and present them to the customer as one consolidated invoice. The initial release of that was restricted to invoices that were generated from sales orders. So if you had multiple sales orders or one sales order with multiple dispatches of items that had more than one invoice, then they could be grouped together to provide one invoice to the customer. From 2020.1, that's now been extended so that standalone invoices can also be grouped. So if you're not using sales orders, if you're creating ad hoc standalone invoices or importing sales invoices into the system, then they can now be grouped together and provided as a consolidated invoice to the customer. There's also now an option to take an invoice that hasn't been grouped and with other ones and manually add it into a group from the individual invoice. There's a button now added to allow that to be grouped, as long as it meets the criteria for grouping them together with common attributes. So So that's just an enhancement to a nice new feature, which is one of the most requested features for NetSuite, which came in the last release and has been enhanced this time. At number 9, we've got the advanced numbering feature. What this brings is a bit more flexibility to how records and transactions are given unique numbers. So you can have a bit more flexibility now in terms of the conventions that are used for the numbering sequences. That means you can have different sequences per transaction type, which might be that you have a different sequence each financial year or other selected criteria. So for different subsidiaries, different financial years, different other conditions in terms of having prefixes, suffixes added on to the numbering sequences. So, for example, you might want to start a new sequence each time the new financial year begins, or if you have a different type of transaction as well within a subtype, then you might want to have a different numbering sequence as well. So that just, again, brings a bit more flexibility to how transactions are identified in the system for traceability and visibility. I should say as well, if anybody has any questions, there's the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. You can write the questions and we'll go through them at the end of the session today. Number 8 we've got is some enhancements to the banking import for importing bank statements. So you may be aware that just after the last release in 2020.2, there was a suite app launched called the Bank Feeds suite app that was made available to European customers. And that allows your bank statements to be automatically imported into NetSuite once per day. And that would then feed into your reconciliation process in terms of matching transactions and doing the reconciliation. So in 2020.1, you'll get some updates to the banking import process. So there's some improvements to the error handling. So if an import only partially completes, then you'll be able to get visibility of that and status of it, and some notifications as well. There's also improved performance for the imports. Up until now, you just get visibility of the end result of an import and the matching process for matching the transactions. So you now get a progress bar to explain how many transactions have been processed so far in terms of the matching process after the import has been done. There's an email notification to let somebody if an import only partially completes, so you're getting alerted to that fact if something fails. And also the ability to mark transactions is cleared while you're reviewing the matches as part of the reconciliation process, which used to be only available in the old version of the reconciliation process as well. So banking for the last couple of releases has been one of the major improvement areas that NetSuite have been working on with the connectivity. So this also just serves as a reminder, if you haven't looked at the connectivity to the banks using the Bank Feed app to do the automatic import, then that is available to be configured now for European customers. Number 7 relates to anybody who uses batch numbered items in the system. So now we're looking at stock items. So that's especially relevant to anybody who has items that need to be traced in batches and have expiry dates. So whether that is for food and beverage or scientific materials or anything that's got a shelf life. So up until now, allocating items to sales orders for customers is manual. So you have to choose which batches you want to allocate to those orders. From 2020.1, then they've introduced a FIFO allocation system, which is first expiry, first out. So the system can automatically assign the best expiry date for the order for the customer to make sure that the oldest stock is going out first. What that is aiming to do is also take into some requirements maybe for the customer. If your customer has a minimum shelf life that they have to have once they receive the items, or that you need to sell it in minimum order quantities, and that will be taken into account in what's allocated to the sales order using this calculation. So that's just trying to automate a process of making sure that the oldest stock goes out first before it expires. So that's relevant to anyone who's got stock items that are batch traced and has expiry dates on them. The next one at number 6 relates to the electronic bank payments suite app. So for payments to suppliers or employees or even customers for electronic payments. So there's a few enhancements to this side. One of the recent changes in the last 12-18 months was the ability to process prepayments to suppliers. So that's the vendor prepayment transactions. these are now available to be paid through the electronic payments app. So just one caveat, you have to mark it as paid first of all. So it's a prepayment, and then that'll be available to be processed within the electronic payments app, along with the actual invoices from the suppliers as well. So that's for any payments on account or deposits to suppliers. There's also an update to make sure that any bills that you have for suppliers that have inactive bank details, so where their bank account details have been made inactive, will now be hidden from the suggested payments. Just from a security point of view, to make sure that you don't pay suppliers where they don't have an active bank account on their account. And the electronic payments is also now compatible with multi-subsidiary customers and suppliers. So that's where you have a single supplier or a customer where you have, within your group structure, pay them through different subsidiaries. And that might mean that they have a different bank account for you to make payments for, if that might be international, for example. So that allows you to have multiple bank accounts within a single supplier that can be used by different subsidiaries to make their payments to that supplier. Number 5 is quite a simple one, but quite powerful. An update to how supplier invoices are generated from purchase orders if you're using receipts. So this means that you can now create supplier invoices directly from item receipts from the purchase order. If the quantities in the item receipt and the purchase order it's come from are different, then the quantity on the item receipt will come off the purchase order. And that means that you can make sure that the invoice that's created from this is accurate if the purchase order has been split into multiple receipts, rather than having to manually amend it or update the quantities on the invoice as it's generated. So there's a bit more just in terms of the automating the flow and the data that comes through onto the invoicing from the receipts themselves. Now, number 4 is also some enhancements to some functionality that came out in the last release. So the supply planning functionality was a replacement for some of the demand planning functionality that existed for quite a few years, which just gave some advanced tools and reports for calculating demand and the supply process to meet the demand. So there's a few enhancements to the supply planning functionality that came out in the last release. Now, the supply planning workbench, which is the interface and dashboard that you use for doing the planning for purchase orders and to meet the demand, has been updated to make sure there's a bit more flexibility in the rules and the reports and KPIs that you get within there. The supply allocation feature, which is a way of pre-allocating or defining rules of how to allocate stock to orders, now includes the option to allocate through sales channels. So if you wanted to define your sales channels as being e-commerce versus B2B or trade, etc., then the rules can be set up to help with automatically making sure a certain amount of stock can be allocated to those channels to make sure that orders can be fulfilled for those channels. And that ties in with the FIFO allocation for the first expiry, first out, uses those rules as well as part of this new engine. As part of this, there's also now an order management dashboard, which gives you all the links and KPIs for managing that allocation feature, which will have some reminders and exception reports on there as well to try and help with the whole supply planning process. Also within the snapshot for supply planning, which is the snapshot with the position of your stock items and the future demand, there's now an extra report called Predicted Available Inventory Balance, which will look at a future prediction of what will be available at a certain point in time for each item. So that gives a bit more insight into the forecasting side for your stock planning as well. So this is a big development area for NetSuite, and as you see, that's getting developed, over each release to bring even more flexibility to the planning process. Okay, so we're into top 3. This one is a really nice feature, actually. Looks as if it will help anybody who's got a multi-subsidiary operation where purchasing is done centrally. So at the moment, if you have that kind of model, then you would tend to either have to raise purchase orders separately in each subsidiary, or raise purchase orders in one subsidiary, receive the stock in, and then do transfers between different locations, which might be owned and operated by different subsidiaries within your group. What the centralized purchasing billing functionality allows you to do is to raise purchase orders within the one entity, but each line on the order can be allocated to another subsidiary within the group and the location that it needs to be delivered to within the subsidiary as well. So this allows one main subsidiary to purchase on behalf of other group companies, which might help with not just the visibility and the streamlined process, but also potentially take advantage of bulk discounts from suppliers if you're ordering for all of your companies at once for stock items or internal equipment, etc. So each line on a purchase order could be then received into locations within the other subsidiaries. So you're not having to create separate transactions for the transfers, which cuts down the number of transfer transactions that are required across the board. And then what happens is there's a process that runs during your period end and the month end close, which automatically creates intercompany cross charges between the purchasing entity and the receiving entity. And that's all automated to make sure that the intercompany transaction is taken care of as part of your month end close. So that's ideal for anybody who has that model of the kind of centralized purchasing and needs to automate the postings that are made as part of that process. Okay. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat with the first two, our top two features. If anybody has been through the release notes already, you'll notice that these aren't actually included in the full release notes at this point. We have looked into it though with NetSuite, and they are still planned for this release, and they're just going through kind of final checks to be put in. But obviously, as I said at the start, there is a chance that they might not make it in to this release, but if not, then pretty sure they would be in the next one at the latest. So number two is one of those, which is the ability to approve transactions from emails. So that means that transactions can be approved from clicking a link in an email rather than having to log into the system or use the mobile app. So this makes it easier for people that maybe aren't in the system all the time or out and about, or even just to speed up the process of getting those approvals done. So they would receive an email with a link to click, and that would trigger the approval. There's an audit trail of those email approvals. So it's done outside of the system, it will still track who has approved it as part of that process. We don't have at the moment, now this is version 1 of this functionality, we don't have a list of the compatible transactions just yet, but we will get that, but it's likely to be the key ones that go through approval, like invoices and purchase orders. As I say, it doesn't appear in the release notes just yet, but it is due to be in the next version, and we've had that confirmed by NetSuite. Just to point out that you might not see that at the moment. But that's a really good feature, I think, in terms of just making sure that the approval process is as quick as it can be for each transaction that needs to go through approval. And finally, we have number 1, which is PO budget alerts and expense commitments. Now, again, this is not listed in the release notes, but has been confirmed as should be added at some point in March to the release notes once they've completed the testing. What this means is that people that are entering purchase orders or purchase order requests, as in unapproved POs, will be warned about potentially exceeding their approved budget based on the available budget that is available to them. So that means that instead of having to have a separate report or to ask somebody if there's budget available, then the users are going to start to get warned or even prevented from creating transactions if they're going to exceed the available budget in there. Again, we don't have the exact criteria in the detail that's available for those alerts in terms of what level the budget check will go to. Again, our thoughts are that would be down to your kind of core classifications level, like the department, class, location, etc. So we're still to get the detail on exactly how that's going to work. But as part of that, then they have mentioned an expense commitment transaction, which would be like a committed cost, which should also be picked up in the calculation. So when we've seen this calculated before, then it tends to be the approved budget. You would take off any commitments that you have, so open POs or other committed costs, planned costs for the future would need to be accounted for in that alert to make sure that they're included in the calculation for the available budget. So we're still to find out a bit more information about this one, but it is quite a big feature that will help just with any sort of approval processes, especially for anybody that's in a non-profit organisation or anybody else that is, strict budget control. So I'd expect more detail later in March on this one once they've updated the notes, which we can obviously you'll be able to access through your dashboard in due course. So that is our summary of the new features. There's obviously hundreds in the actual release notes, which you can look through. Some are more relevant to certain types of businesses than others, where they relate to industries or certain regions that you might operate in. So I'd recommend having a look through just to see if there's anything specific that might apply to your business. And obviously to encourage you to activate the release preview and carry out your testing and let us know if you find any issues or queries or anything with the testing that you go through before your upgrade is due. So I'm just going to have a look and see if there's any questions, and this is the opportunity to ask more questions if anybody has any before we finish up the session. You can use the chat or the Q&A is there as well to ask specific questions. So we have a question about the email approval. So the question is, does the approval email impact the number of licensed users required? The answer to that one is we don't know at this point. We're still waiting for the exact solution. So we don't know at this point whether you still need to have a license for NetSuite to do that approval, or whether anybody could be in the organisation could be part of that. Our initial thought was that you probably would still need to have a license because you might want to log in to see the transaction rather than just approving it from the email. So we still need to look into that, but our prediction is that you probably will still need a license to do it. It's just another way of doing it, a different interface for doing it. But we can confirm that once we know the detail. Okay, so a couple other questions. So how can my colleagues access the recording? We will send you a copy of this recording in an email after this session, and you can forward that on to any colleagues that weren't available to attend. On the approval emails, does the information show from the transaction that is needing approved? We, again, still need to find out a bit more detail about that, but there will be at least some headline information in that email. What we don't know is whether you would have line level information or whether it's just going to be overall information like the supplier, the total amount, and the people that have requested it. And you maybe have to log in and see more detail. That's kind of how it works in the mobile app at the moment. But we would hope that the email templates would be configurable to allow us to show a bit more detail. But that's one that we still need to find out a bit more and see that in practice. And then a question to say that we have some bespoke work around our approval process, which forces us to put in a reason when we reject a transaction. So again, sorry, we can't give any more information. We still need to see this working and try it out for ourselves. My first thought on that would be that probably wouldn't be applicable in that case, that we don't even know if you can reject from an email at this point, or whether it's just an approval and you maybe have to still log in to do the rejection. But I'm pretty sure that will be just a standardized process, and maybe need to still log into the system to trigger any custom processes. So from what we understand, it is a clicking on a link to approve it rather than replying to it. So we don't know if there will be an option to add in a reason or anything from that if rejection is an option. Okay, so I think that's all the questions that were sent through. If anyone has any other questions at all, then please just contact your account manager. I'd be happy to answer anything that we've seen today. So if there's anything that's of interest, then just let us know. You will get an alert when your upgrade date is available to you. And obviously we would just again reiterate that please do activate your release preview and test your processes, and let us know if you find anything that we need to look at from a support perspective. But yeah, thanks very much for joining today. I appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully that's been useful to give you a bit of insight into what's coming next. And thank you very much.